Did you know that Uganda is Africa's top coffee producer and one of the world's top 10 coffee exporters? In May 2025, Uganda officially became Africa's top exporter, shipping 47,000 tons, a 43% growth year-on-year. Uganda grows two main types of coffee: Robusta, which actually originated here, around the Lake Victoria Basin, and Arabica, grown high up in the mountains of Elgon and the Rwenzori.
Decades, coffee imports entered the United States largely duty-free, but now some of America's top trading partners are facing double-digit tariffs on their imports, including coffee. That's true of Brazil, the largest supplier of coffee to the United States. Its exports now face a 50% tariff into America. It's straining an industry that provides more than 1 million jobs in the US, and it's poised to strain prices too.
You're going to see some substantial announcements over the next couple of days in terms of things we don't grow here in the United States. Coffee being one of them, bananas, other fruits, things like that. So that will bring the prices down very quickly.
Did you know Uganda is Africa's largest coffee exporter and ranks third globally? Our coffee is renowned for its rich flavor and high quality. Now let's check out today's farm gate prices per kilogram. Kiboko at 6,000, Drugar at 11,000, FAQ at 11,500, and Arabica Parchment at 12,000. Whether you're a coffee lover or just curious, Uganda's coffee has something special for everyone.
Let me break down these numbers for you. Inflation overall up 2.7%. The big reason there, not coffee, but shelter prices. The cost of housing still remains higher than a year ago and significantly higher, as well as medical costs, used car and truck prices, and airfares. But then you come to this coffee question. Prices up 14.5% from a year ago. Ground beef prices, incidentally, also up double digits from a year ago. And those coffee prices, according to analysts...
Did you know Uganda is Africa's largest coffee exporter and ranks third globally? Our coffee is renowned for its rich flavor and high quality. Now let's check out today's farm gate prices per kilogram. Kiboko at 6,000, Drugar at 11,000, FAQ at 11,500, and Arabica Parchment at 12,000. Whether you're a coffee lover or just curious, Uganda's coffee has something special for everyone. Did you know Uganda is Africa's largest coffee exporter and ranks third globally? Our coffee is renowned for its rich flavor and high quality. Now let's check out today's farm gate prices per kilogram. Kiboko at 6,000, Drugar at 11,000, FAQ at 11,500, and Arabica Parchment at 12,000. Whether you're a coffee lover or just curious, Uganda's coffee has something special for everyone.
This is the issue of coffee. The global value of coffee businesses currently is US $460 billion. 460 billion. This is the value of the coffee in the world. However, all the coffee producing countries in the world, Africa, Brazil, Colombia, Vietnam, all of us, take only US $25 billion out of this. The coffee business in the world, 460 billion. All of us, the coffee producers in the world, our share, $25 billion. Africa's share is US $2.5 billion. Out of the 460 billion, Africa's share is $2.4 billion. With Uganda taking $800 million, because we are now producing 800 million bags of 60 kilograms each.
I hope Trump, for example, does not keep high tariffs on African countries because I need my coffee in the morning. And if we try to grow coffee in Central Park, first, the coffee is going to be miserable if it grows at all. It's going to be extraordinarily expensive because there'll be a few beans for all those Starbucks across the United States.
The shock to the United States did not come gradually. It arrived like a sudden tremor shaking the entire agricultural sector, leaving officials scrambling for explanations. For decades, America had enjoyed firm dominance in the global coffee market through powerful trade networks, heavily subsidized farms, and long-standing supply contracts. But that dominance shattered almost overnight when Africa unveiled a coordinated coffee revolution so massive, so strategic, and so economically disruptive that Washington was completely blindsided. The shift began quietly. Several African countries stretching from the highlands of East Africa to the fertile valleys of Central Africa had spent years restructuring their agricultural systems. New irrigation infrastructure, modern processing plants, state-funded research programs, and partnerships with countries like China, Brazil, and India transformed the continent's coffee production. What had once been fragmented and underfunded became an integrated economic machine. Africa no longer exported raw beans alone. Instead, it had moved aggressively into processing, packaging, and branding its own premium quality coffee. The continent was no longer a supplier. It had become a competitor. The breakthrough moment came when Africa launched a unified coffee export platform, linking major producers into a single continent-wide market. This platform standardized quality, streamlined logistics, and set competitive pricing that stunned global buyers. Africa's new blends were not only cheaper but richer in flavor, organically cultivated and ethically sourced, all qualities increasingly valued in Europe, Asia, and South America. Global coffee chains, eager to advertise sustainability and affordability, switched suppliers almost immediately. The U.S. was caught off guard as international demand shifted toward Africa with shocking speed. What made the situation worse for America was that Africa's coffee was no longer processed abroad. New factories across Ethiopia, Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania, Cameroon, and Congo produced high-grade roasted beans ready for shelves worldwide. These factories operated at lower costs due to cheaper energy partnerships with China and newly built rail and port systems financed through Africa-Asia infrastructure agreements. Shipping was faster, cheaper, and far more reliable than the U.S. supply chain, which was still recovering from years of logistical problems. As African coffee captured global markets, American farmers felt the impact immediately. Prices for U.S. coffee beans began to drop dramatically, and contracts with major international buyers were terminated in favor of Africa's new platform. Brazil, Vietnam, and Colombia reacted by cutting their prices too, but none could match Africa's combination of quality, sustainability, and affordability. The U.S. Agricultural Department predicted a minor disruption, expecting Africa's momentum to fade. But within 3 months, the losses had escalated past anything Washington had imagined. The estimated $12 billion loss was not simply a result of falling coffee prices. It was the consequence of a total restructuring of global coffee power, with Africa at the center. American farmers struggled to compete with African technology-driven cultivation. New irrigation systems, climate-smart farming, and soil regeneration techniques doubled Africa's yields. Meanwhile, U.S. coffee farms, concentrated mostly in Hawaii and limited regions of California, could not expand production or lower costs. American coffee had always relied on branding, heritage, and marketing. Now none of that mattered. The crisis deepened when African nations signed exclusive supply agreements with major European and Asian coffee distributors. These agreements locked out U.S. exporters, reshaping the global value chain. Retailers across Germany, China, South Korea, France, and the United Kingdom announced partnerships with Africa's new coffee bloc, promoting the products as premium and environmentally responsible. Social media campaigns celebrating African coffee went viral, elevating demand even further. Washington responded with emergency subsidies for farmers, but the market had already shifted. Even domestic U.S. consumers began buying African coffee as prices in American supermarkets dropped sharply. African brands entered the U.S. market, with aggressive pricing, undercutting local producers by margins that U.S. farmers could not survive. The marketing narrative changed. Consumers now viewed African coffee as fresher, richer, and more authentic. American coffee brands were forced into clearance sales, liquidation, and rebranding attempts that failed to stop the bleeding. Geopolitically, the shift created a diplomatic headache for the United States. Africa's risen. The coffee industry strengthened its global leverage, allowing the continent to negotiate trade deals from a position of power. Nations that once depended on U.S. agricultural exports began aligning more closely with Africa-China partnerships. Washington issued public statements praising Africa's economic progress, but behind closed doors, officials debated strategies to regain influence. Some proposed increasing U.S. investments in African agriculture to secure partial control over the booming sector. Others suggested imposing tariffs on African coffee entering the American market, though this risked damaging relations with a continent that had become central to global supply chains. The shift also affected America's internal politics. legislators from farming states demanded action, accusing federal agencies of failing to protect domestic agriculture. Economic experts warned that the coffee crisis could spread to other crops as Africa continued modernizing its farming sector. For the first time, American farmers openly discussed transitioning two different crops, admitting that the country could no longer compete with Africa's scale and efficiency. International analysts described Africa as coffee rise as one of the most significant agricultural revolutions in modern history. It did not happen by accident. It was the result of coordinated planning, strategic alliances, and a determination to reclaim value that Africa had lost for centuries through raw exports. The continent had used technology, diplomacy, and continental unity to reshape global trade, and the world had no choice but to adjust. America, once confident in its agricultural superiority, found itself confronting a new reality. Africa was no longer a passive participant in global markets. It was now a leading force, capable of shifting entire industries. And while Washington scrambled to mitigate the $12 billion loss, Africa continued expanding its reach, announcing new partnerships with Middle Eastern retailers, Latin American distributors, and Asian e-commerce platforms. The rise of African coffee was more than a market disruption. It was a symbol of changing global power. A reminder that the world no longer revolved around a handful of traditional economic giants. A signal that Africa, long underestimated, had finally claimed its place in the global economy. And the U.S., facing a crisis it never saw coming, was forced to confront a future where Africa, not America, set the pace in one of the world's most profitable agricultural industries. The shockwaves of Africa's coffee takeover did not stop at the financial losses reported by U.S. farmers. They rippled through the entire structure of global agricultural power, exposing vulnerabilities that Washington had kept hidden for years. While the U.S. attempted to stabilize its collapsing coffee industry, Africa was already moving to the next phase of its strategy, one that went far beyond outperforming a single agricultural product. The continent had discovered a formula: unity, technology, and continental integration could dismantle long-standing global hierarchies faster than anyone expected, and nowhere was this more visible than in the rapidly evolving trade war between African agriculture and U.S. agribusiness. The first major escalation came when Africa announced an unprecedented agricultural investment fund directed at expanding its coffee operations into large-scale semi-mechanized estates. Several African countries, empowered by new partnerships with China, India, and the Middle East, pooled billions of dollars into a continental agricultural modernization program. This program subsidized modern equipment, satellite-based farm mapping, digital irrigation systems, and high-capacity processing factories that drastically reduced production costs, while U.S. farmers struggled with rising land prices, aging machinery, and high labor costs. African farmers operated with state-of-the-art technology and foreign-backed financing that was nearly impossible to compete with. Markets reacted quickly. Multinational companies that once sourced heavily from U.S. farms shifted supply chains to Africa, signing long-term contracts that guaranteed stable prices and reliable deliveries. American shipping companies, already struggling with higher fuel costs, watched as Africa's upgraded ports funded through Africa-Asia infrastructure alliances became new hubs for global agricultural exports. The U.S. logistics sector lost billions in projected revenue as traders rerouted operations to Mombasa, Durban, Lagos, and Djibouti. The United States attempted to respond by launching its own agricultural stimulus package, offering subsidies, tax breaks, and loans to domestic coffee growers. But while Washington talked about strengthening local farms, global investors focused on Africa, where profits were rising exponentially. Even U.S.-based corporations invested in African processing plants, quietly acknowledging that future growth was no longer in America as domestic farmland but in Africa as booming, investor-friendly agricultural markets. The effect on the U.S. workforce was severe. As more farmers defaulted on loans, rural communities faced a wave of bankruptcies. Agricultural unions warned that the collapse of coffee was only the beginning. Soybean farmers, corn producers, and even dairy operators expressed fear that Africa's rise would eventually expand into other crops. For years, the U.S. had assumed that African agriculture would remain dependent, underdeveloped, and unable to match Western efficiency. But Africa's new agricultural revolution had rewritten the rules entirely. Meanwhile, Africa capitalized on its momentum. African nations launched an international branding campaign promoting the continent as the new home of premium coffee. The campaign highlighted Africa's rich soils, unique climates, and centuries-old coffee traditions. European and Asian influencers toured African plantations, showcasing sustainable farming, women-led cooperatives, and community-owned estates that contrasted sharply with America's corporate-driven agricultural model. Suddenly, Africa's coffee not only dominated on price and quality but also carried a cultural authenticity that global consumers embraced enthusiastically. Washington watched this unfold with growing frustration. U.S. trade officials tried to negotiate new agreements with African governments, hoping to secure partial access to the booming market, but African authorities, confident in their new position, prioritized partnerships with Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America instead. In diplomatic meetings, African representatives made one message clear: their objective was to build an independent economic identity, free from historical imbalances that once defined global trade. The geopolitical consequences became unavoidable. Europe, which relied heavily on U.S. agricultural imports for decades, began reducing purchase volumes from America to align with Africa's new pricing standards. Asian markets, always price-sensitive and quality-driven, shifted nearly half their coffee imports to Africa. Middle Eastern distributors went further, signing exclusivity agreements that guaranteed African coffee dominance for the next decade. With every new contract Africa secured, the U.S. lost influence. Coffee may have seemed small compared to oil, technology, or minerals, but it symbolized something much larger: the weakening grip of U.S. agricultural supremacy and the rise of Africa as a global economic force. Back in the U.S., the political pressure intensified. Senators from agricultural states demanded stronger action, claiming the administration had underestimated Africa's capabilities. Some proposed retaliatory tariffs on African agricultural products, though this risked damaging relations with dozens of rapidly growing African economies. Others pushed for aggressive marketing campaigns to encourage Americans to buy American coffee, but domestic consumers prioritized low prices and high quality, exactly what Africa was offering. Within Africa, the transformation was celebrated as a historic turning point. Coffee towns that once struggled with underfunding saw new roads, schools, and hospitals built from export revenues. Farmers who once lived in poverty gained access to modern equipment, credit lines, and global markets. Cooperative unions grew stronger, empowering local communities instead of foreign corporations. For the first time, African farmers were not just producers, they were global competitors shaping international trade flows. The most striking shift came from Africa's strategic decision to move up the value chain. Instead of selling beans alone, Africa began exporting branded packaged coffee directly to international consumers. African-owned companies launched e-commerce platforms targeting buyers in Europe, Asia, and even the U.S. American coffee brands, once dominant in global supermarkets, found themselves pushed off shelves by new African competitors offering superior flavor at lower prices. The humiliation for Washington was deepened when African coffee won several international quality awards, beating American, Brazilian, and Colombian brands. The victory confirmed what the market was already seeing: Africa had mastered both quality and scale. By the end of the crisis, U.S. economists admitted openly that the losses were irreversible. Africa's coffee sector had become too powerful, too efficient, and too well coordinated to be challenged. Washington's agricultural analysts warned that unless the U.S. reinvented its farming industry, similar collapses could occur in other sectors. Africa's success showed the world that with the right strategy, even industries dominated by global giants could be overturned. What was once seen as an underdog had become the new powerhouse. Africa had not only crashed America's coffee market but had demonstrated a model for economic liberation that other developing regions began studying closely. And while U.S. farmers struggled to survive, Africa continued to scale its agricultural revolution, turning its newfound strength into long-term global influence. The collapse of the U.S. coffee market marked only the beginning of a larger transformation that reshaped global agricultural power. As Africa expanded its influence, Washington realized that the crisis was not simply about coffee, it was about the shifting balance of global economic authority. Africa's rise exposed deep structural weaknesses in the U.S. food supply system, weaknesses that had been ignored for generations. While Washington attempted damage control, Africa accelerated its agricultural revolution, turning what began as a market disruption into a fully fledged continental strategy for dominance. The turning point came when Africa announced a unified agricultural export framework under the Continental Free Trade Bloc. This framework standardized production, pricing, transport, and quality regulations across member countries. For the first time, African farmers were not competing against one another. They were competing against the world as a coordinated force. The U.S. had long assumed that Africa's fragmented political landscape would prevent such unity. Instead, Africa demonstrated the kind of coordination that had eluded Western agricultural systems for decades. U.S. analysts underestimated how powerful this unity would become. With harmonized trade policies, Africa negotiated directly with Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, securing massive long-term contracts. These deals not only increased market stability but also empowered African governments to invest heavily in rural infrastructure, processing centers, fertilizer factories, irrigation networks, and research institutions. Every investment strengthened Africa's position while widening the gap between African and American agricultural performance. As Africa grew stronger, the U.S. became increasingly desperate. Washington pushed for emergency talks with African trade ministers, attempting to regain access to a market that had once been predictable. But African leaders refused to bend. They insisted that any new agreement must acknowledge Africa as an equal partner, not a subordinate supplier. For Washington, this shift in tone was shocking. For Africa, it was long overdue. The situation reached a new height of tension when Africa launched its Continental Agricultural Reserve, a massive strategic stockpile of coffee, grains, spices, and cash crops designed to stabilize global prices. This move stunned U.S. policymakers because it mirrored the behavior of major economic powers like China and the Gulf states. Africa was no longer reacting to global markets. It was shaping them. Meanwhile, U.S. farmers faced their darkest period in decades. Bankruptcies soared. Rural towns emptied as families abandoned farms that had been passed down through generations. Grain silos, once symbols of American abundance, stood half empty. Auction houses filled with tractors and harvesters from farmers who could no longer afford to maintain their operations. The psychological blow was as heavy as the economic one. Many Americans grew resentful, insisting that Africa's success was somehow engineered to undermine the U.S. But global analysts pointed to a harder truth. Africa won because it built something the U.S. had neglected: innovation. African agriculture had become a magnet for global technology. Drones monitored crop health, satellites optimized planting cycles, AI managed irrigation systems minimized water usage. Chinese and Indian engineers worked alongside African researchers to develop high-yield seedlings that thrived in diverse climates. These scientific advancements allowed Africa to increase productivity at rates the U.S. had not seen in more than half a century. At the same time, Africa's massive youth population became an agricultural workforce that operated with an entrepreneurial mindset. Young people who once dreamed of leaving rural areas now returned to start agritech companies, coffee cooperatives, and export businesses. International investors poured billions into African startups, funding everything from fertilizer innovation to logistics platforms connecting farmers directly with foreign buyers. The U.S. could not match the energy or the innovation. Its aging workforce struggled to adopt new technologies, and decades of underinvestment left many rural regions unable to modernize quickly enough. Europe, caught in the middle, watched its long-standing agricultural ties with the U.S. weaken. African nations offered Europe better prices, faster delivery, and more favorable trade terms. Asian importers went further, publicly praising Africa's efficiency and environmental sustainability. Africa became the global symbol of what modern agriculture could achieve. From farming conferences to trade expos, African nations drew enormous crowds eager to learn how a formerly overlooked region had reinvented itself as the new agricultural capital of the world. In Washington, the political backlash intensified. Critics accused policymakers of arrogance, saying they ignored warnings about Africa's accelerating growth. Economists acknowledged that the U.S. had been too comfortable, relying on its historical dominance instead of preparing for a future where emerging economies were not merely catching up, they were overtaking. The collapse of the coffee market served as the final confirmation. The U.S. could no longer assume leadership in every global industry. Africa, meanwhile, showed no signs of slowing. With coffee exports booming, the continent expanded its agricultural strategy into new sectors: cocoa, cashew, sugarcane, livestock feed, and fruit processing. Africa's rising middle class fueled domestic demand, creating a robust internal market that insulated the continent from global shocks. Countries built railways and ports designed primarily for agricultural exports, making their supply chains almost unbeatable. For every U.S. attempt to recover, Africa introduced new technologies, new pricing models, or new trade alliances that pushed the U.S. further into disadvantage. One of the most dramatic shifts occurred when Africa partnered with Asia to establish a global commodity pricing board. This board influenced the prices of coffee, cocoa, and other cash crops, reducing the dominance of Western buyers. For decades, U.S. companies had dictated global commodity prices. Now Africa held the pen. Washington labeled the move a direct threat to global market stability, but Africa called it economic justice. In the final stage of the crisis, Africa delivered the decisive blow, the unveiling of a continent-wide agricultural innovation corridor stretching across multiple regions. This mega-project combined farmland, research labs, processing zones, renewable energy stations, and digital infrastructure into a single unified system. Experts predicted that it would triple Africa's agricultural output within a decade. The announcement triggered a collapse in U.S. agricultural futures markets as traders realized that the U.S. would struggle to compete for years, perhaps generations. By the end of the conflict, global analysts concluded that Africa's takeover of the coffee market had triggered an irreversible shift in economic power. Africa had proven that with unity, strategy, and investment, even the world's most powerful economies could be challenged. The U.S., once confident in its agricultural supremacy, now faced a harsh new reality. Africa had risen, and the world's agricultural future was no longer American, it was African. And while Washington scrambled to regain its footing, Africa pressed forward, turning its coffee revolution into a continental legacy that would influence global trade for decades to come.